In the spirit of Repetitive Strain Injury Day, or RSI Day, let's start by looking at some Canadian numbers. The Association of Workers' Compensation Board of Canada has released this report on the National Work Injury, Disease and Fatality Statistics. It combines the numbers from every province and territory. Here's the number of repetitive motion accepted lost claims for each province in 2019 in gray, in 2020 in orange, and in 2021 in the dark blue. The bigger numbers on the right-hand side are the total accepted lost time claims for each year. Generally, it looks like Canada tends to have around 7,500 people a year lose time to a repetitive motion injury. You may be thinking 7,500 isn't a lot, but we can add the lost time claims that were accepted for overexertion as well. So aside from the little dip in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, it looks like we have between 46 and 47,000 Canadians losing time because they have overexerted themselves. Today, we are going to be discussing physical and cognitive demands analysis. So not only could we look at lost time claims from overexertion and repetitive motion, but we could also include things like bodily reaction and exertion, exposure to harmful substances or environments, exposure to electrical energy, contact with temperature extremes, exposure to noise, and exposure to traumatic or stressful events. Those are all things that show up in our PDA and CDAs as things to take note of. The number of Canadians with accepted lost time claims from the previously mentioned list is 228,843 in the last three years. For things that should have been identified as a concern in a PDA and a CDA if these things were being done in a proactive manner ahead of these injuries occurring. Now, this is very crude data with a threshold of allowed claims in every province and territory. So please keep in mind these numbers don't include days workers may have taken off to recover themselves. It doesn't include the claims that were disallowed. And these numbers do not reflect how long these workers had to be off to recover from their injuries. The CAMH Workplace Mental Health Review and Recommendations states, for many, work is a source of well-being, an opportunity to be productive and contribute to society. For a significant number of others, however, work can be a source of stress that leads to poor mental health and/or the place when mental illness can manifest. By 2041, it is estimated that the cumulative cost of poor mental health to the Canadian economy will exceed $2.5 trillion. The cost of lost productivity from depression was 23 times higher than the cost of treating that depression in the healthcare system. It should be noted that this report was written pre-pandemic, but ultimately it will be in everyone's best interest to try as hard as possible to keep workers' stress levels at a manageable level.
So now let's look at the future of our workforce. Here in the here's the 2021 Canadian census data of our population. In the center, we have age. On the left and right, you see the year of birth. From the center, you'll see the number of males out to the left, and then to the right, the number of females. So we're in the midst of high job vacancies and historically low unemployment, and Canada faces record retirements from an aging labor force. So you see here in orange, the top box, the number of older adults age 65 plus grows 6 times faster than the number of children we have 0 to 14 years old. So the working age population, which is people aged 15 to 64, has never been older. More than 1 in 5 people in this population is close to retirement. That is, they're aged 55 to 65, so that dark blue box at the top. So this proportion represents an all-time high in the history of Canadian census. So this is a Pear Deck slide, and we have a multiple choice question here. Yes, so which generation has the largest number of people in the working age population? So remember, we're looking at anything in the orange. So I'll give you a second just to answer there on the Pear Deck.
race here.
Oh, okay.
What you don't see in the background is we have a little chart that's running up these numbers as you're answering. So it looks like it's a tight race between the boomers and the millennials, Katie.
Awesome.
Do you want to put them out of their misery? What is the right answer?
Okay, so okay. Yeah, sorry. So 1 in 3 people aged 15 to 64 are actually millennials. And so millennials are the generation now, as boomers continue to retire. Millennials are the generation with the largest number of people in the working age population. So again, that's the 15 to 64 years old. So in the census, they had 23,900,000 Canadians in that working age population, and about 33.2% were millennials, 29.5% were Gen Xers, 19.7% were baby boomers, and 17.6% were Gen Zers. So it's really important just to understand that since each generation has distinct values and attitudes and is at a different stage in their lives, this can have an impact on our labor market. So what do millennials actually want from their workplace? We're going to have there's so many in the workforce. What do they really want? The Deloitte survey of millennials found that pay and financial benefits drive millennials' choice organization more than anything else. We can't blame millennials for wanting this first. So including the present crisis, this age group has now experienced the slowest economic growth since entering the workforce than any other generation. The combinations of the global financial crises and wage suppression, with the placing of an increasing significance on university and college education, so increasing debt, has created this want. Excluding salary, in most markets, work-life balance comes before career progression when millennials evaluate job opportunities as well. So please stop posting jobs without the salary on them. Millennials are probably not going to bargain with you, and if anything, they won't look to waste their time at all with your application process. What about Gen Z? So Gen Z is that next generation that's going to be entering the workforce. They will not have as significant an impact just because there are actually just less of them. But it's very important to understand that for Gen Z, mental health in their workplace really matters. So 3 of 4 Gen Z employees would voluntarily leave a job for mental health reasons, where this was previously 2 of 4 for our millennial employees. This really highlights the importance of capturing workplace stressors and implementing controls. The new workforce will not stay in a job where their mental health is being affected, regardless ultimately of how much money you spend onboarding or training them. So I think this is worth celebrating. Congratulations to the baby boomers and Gen X. We have arrived. You've raised a generation of children who broadly, they want to be compensated fairly for their work and education and seek a good work-life balance to be able to contribute equally to their families. Their health, both physical and mental, matters to them. The ambition to make positive contributions to their organization's success and or to the world in general also rates highly.
Millennials value their mental health, and that this will dictate what types of jobs they pursue and the type of workplace that they seek out. We need to take a look at the allowed mental stress claims that are now coming under WSIB. And we can see that in the last 10 years, those claims have essentially tripled. And although the traumatic mental stress and the post-traumatic stress disorder categories dominate this chart, basically the gray and the green, those underlying blue cases of chronic mental stress are of importance for practitioners who are needing to complete cognitive demands analysis that will identify the tasks and jobs that are leading to stress in this scenario. From Statistics Canada census data, the number of Ontario workers aged 18 to 34, those millennials, reporting that their perceived mental health as very good or excellent is only 47.6%. That's below both the two older generations above them. And 21.8% of them rate their perceived life stress most days as being quite a bit or extremely stressful. It's widely accepted that workplace mental stress affects worker productivity and is now starting to affect the global economy. Whereas understanding the job demands that were going to lead to physical injury from overuse, excessive load, or repetition have been the norm, there is now recognition that documenting the chronic stress induced from workplace cognitive demands is also of critical importance. So the old workforce problem used to be that the baby boomers were getting old in jobs that required ongoing physical demands, as well as ongoing demands on their cognitive resources. And those are the resources that will have a noticeable decline with age, things like auditory processes, reaction time, attention, decision-making. However, the new workforce problem is that the effects of the pandemic on the resulting workforce has seen a dramatic shift. So a portion of the working baby boomer population either died in the pandemic and left the workplace prematurely, or there's a growing number of that generation that just are not returning to work earlier than would have been anticipated. If we look at this chart, this is the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board of Ontario, or WSIB's allowed occupational disease categories by count. We can see that the percent of claim account on the vertical axis and the year on the horizontal axis. Pre-pandemic, acute exposure and effects, which are in light blue, and specifically noise-induced hearing loss in dark blue, used to account for 85% or more of the allowed occupational disease claims. But now the allowable COVID-19 claims has taken over since 2020, and it continues to rise, even though there is an acknowledged decrease of allowed claims in this category. Worse, there are recent findings suggesting that the remaining eligible workforce will have accelerated aging systems and structures resulting from COVID-19 infection, making it even more important to be able to quantify the cognitive demands that they will encounter in their work life. If we continue to think about the effects of the pandemic on this future workforce, we have increasing evidence that there is long-term brain fog. This will have an effect on cognitive demands, and the effects will be seen in the workplace. We know that there are long-term cardiovascular implications and effects that will have impacts on the safety, the exposures, the environmental demands that workers experience in the workforce. We now know there is evidence for decreased muscle strength. Again, that will have an impact on the physical demands that workers encounter in the workplace. All of this will have a ripple effect on how we complete our job demands analysis.
Okay, so today, now recognizing the importance of understanding the demands of a job, we're going to be looking at both physical and cognitive demands analysis. So we'll start with the formal definition here. A physical demands analysis is a structured evaluation of the physical, environmental, cognitive, and physiological demands associated with performing a specific job.
You may have heard of a cognitive demands analysis, and this is a comprehensive listing of the cognitive demands inherent to the task or job, and a description of the cognitive resources required by the worker to effectively complete those tasks. And if we are completing a CDA in the workplace, we are trying to perform an objective evaluation of the cognitive, emotional, and psychological skills required to perform the essential duties of a position.
So there are a lot of people who need to be able to understand information from these documents during the injury prevention stage. So here on the left, we may have ergonomists, OHS personnel, Joint Health and Safety Committee or committee members, managers or supervisors, all of which are on the call today. Our Human Resources Department might need to know the job requirements, and ultimately for safety engineers to be able to engineer or design solutions, they must understand the job requirements. On the flip side, after an injury, the people who are caring for us, including but definitely not limited to here, ER doctors and registered nurses, There can be family doctor, nurse practitioners, chiropractors, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, clinical psychologists, and social workers. And of course, the ones who are covering our salary after an injury. So insurance providers, worker safety and insurance boards, and any form of workers' compensation, really.
When we think about invisible impairments or hidden conditions, these are the things that are going to be important to understand when we are completing our CDA. So invisible impairments can affect performance in significant ways. And in 2001, the Participation in Physical Activity Limitation Survey found that 2.2% of Canadians identified themselves having a psychiatric disability. These numbers continue to increase with both identification and diagnosis of a broader range of conditions. Many workers may be either unaware of their condition, maybe aware but not self-disclose these conditions. Many workers may end up masking these symptoms while they're at work or if they're on medication. This may not be a long-term or sustainable solution for workplaces. These unseen limits can be difficult for the worker to communicate to their supervisor, especially without a diagnosis for accommodation. And so we've got some of the more common, perhaps hidden conditions that might be impacting workers while they're at work, as well as a listing of some of those cognitive demands that we're going to start to talk about and that might be typical of that condition. So it would be not unusual for someone suffering from concussion or traumatic brain injury to have issues with working memory, sustained attention, mental flexibility, for instance. Anxiety and mood disorders, of which there are many in a variety of different levels, could have issues with problem solving, sequencing errors, information processing. Of course, the aging process in and of itself is linked to known decrements in auditory processing, visual processing, short-term memory. The broad listing of neurodivergent brains may have issues with things like sustained attention, executive planning, impulsivity, emotional recognition, and temporal awareness. And then again, chronic health problems, which are varied, and I couldn't list all of them for sure. But picking out some of the things that are commonly seen there: decreased attention, communication, sequencing errors, and time management might be of concern. And of course, there are many more that I haven't discussed here.
So there are a lot of standards organizations, a lot of ergonomic standards organizations. However, there are three primary international organizations that do develop our ergonomic standards. So we've got the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, the European Committee for Standardization, CEN, and the International Labor Organization. Each of these organizations have subcommittees or working groups that outline ergonomic standards across a variety of topics. Although a variety of standards have been developed in the field of ergonomics by these organizations, following them is predominantly voluntary, and there's a lack of standardization when it does come to establishing principles for performing a job demands analysis. Since job demands analysis are not a standardized document, the components included in them can really vary by the evaluator, the company, and the job. So the way we name these documents, it really doesn't make that much sense. It's not that intuitive for their relationship. So at this point, physical, cognitive, and environmental exposure analysis are all thought of as separate sections of an analysis to be conducted with little overlap. When in reality, all three sections should be done simultaneously for each task. So let's say the task is to lift and move a box to the moving truck. Not only are there physical demands required for lifting that box, the cognitive demands of where the box has to go also exist, and how are we going to maneuver our way to get there. Then at the same time, we're lifting and moving the box. We also have to assess the safety, of walking down the stairs or maybe crossing a road. lots of critical thought and movement processes happen without us even knowing, especially as we continue to gain more experience. So that being said, the fact that there is no standard template for evaluating job demands has kind of led us, our research team, to do a critical review. And so the aim of a critical review is to perform an extensive review of the literature for the purpose of critically assessing it. So material for critical reviews can originate from diverse sources, with the outcome of the analysis of this material being a model or a hypothesis. So the idea we had is to assess and amalgamate as many templates as possible to create what Courtney refers to as the ultimate job demands analysis template. So through this critical review process, we had an identification stage where we use repositories, Omni and Google Scholar. We also used other sources as well, like from the references, our Safe Work Association websites, the workers' compensation boards. There was a screening and eligibility phase. And so during that time, initially 119 titles and abstracts were screened. Then it was determined, 51 of those were actually eligible to be. The eligibility criteria was, in essence, that they had an actual PDA template for us to evaluate. So from there, the ones that in the inclusion, the ones that really didn't that overlapped but were their own templates, we ended up having 37 PDA templates for our evaluation. And so to start the critical review, these were all of the major sections that we had identified. And here you can see job demands, obviously a major section, job overview and task summary, exposure environment. There was a job design section that was important, equipment, tools, and materials. And so we took a 50% threshold. So if 50% of the 37 had that section in there, then we continued to evaluate it. Within that first initial job demand section, there were multiple things being evaluated at varying degrees. And so unsurprisingly, 35 of the 37 PDAs had a section involving manual materials handling, or MMH. All of those 35 PDAs had a section with a carrying, lifting, pushing, pulling, which we'll see today. 94.6% had methods of evaluating like static work. So our sitting, standing, balancing, and upper extremity work with reaching, grasping, or throwing. Then there was also methods of evaluating mobility in this section. So we saw some of this with the ambulation, walking, running, jumping. Was the worker required to kneel, crouch, or crawl, or squat? And any climbing or descending was noted, all of which we have probably seen in some form of checklist before here. So posture analysis was the next big section, and that was conducted in 25 of the 35 PDAs. And then you see a drop after that after the fine finger hand dexterity, there's the sensory and perception. And then the psychosocial and cognitive demands was actually only captured 16 out of 35 PDAs. So this means that really less than half of the job demand sections of the templates that were included in this study even had something to prompt any form of documenting for psychosocial or cognitive demands of the worker. So from the job demands section, the two major sections we assessed further were manual materials handling and posture analysis. But really, before we get into these manual materials handling examples, it's important to understand that frequency here was captured in multiple ways. Here are the first three methods. So there was frequency with just the number of times an activity was required during a shift. There was also frequency rated 1 to 4, where 1 was seldom, not daily, and 4 was high frequency demand with repetition greater than 3 hours daily. And there was frequency of a work day. So this was ranging from not required at all at 0% of the shift, or constant, which here is considered between 67 to 100% of the shift.
Now, for those of you who maybe are just joining us late, and want to get in on the interactive stuff, we're going to have a few interactive slides coming up. So joinpd.com, and the code that you see on the screen now is how you get in. This is totally optional, but I saw that there was some messages in the chat about what's going on. So if you want to continue on the WebEx as well, and the Pear Deck on another device or on another browser, that is your link. Thank you for whoever is keeping our chat going. So Katie's gonna give you a scenario here.
Okay, so we have a scenario. Let's start with a scenario where you have a dental hygienist has 8 appointments to clean teeth. Each appointment lasts 1 hour. The dental hygienist must use the high-powered electrical brush and gritty toothpaste to clean the teeth after removing the tartar. So this can take between 5 to 7 minutes. So given this scenario, what is the frequency of high-powered electrical brush use? You just got a multiple choice question there.
Do I need a calculator to figure this out?
Maybe,
Yeah, maybe.
maybe.
Okay.
Best guesses.
Best guesses? People are going with their best guess. Some people are actually doing the calculation, I bet you.
There we go.
If I was in the workplace doing this PDA, I should definitely use a calculator.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we don't go through like the list of tools that you would normally take with you for a PDA,
Okay. Yes.
but like, at some point you need to pull out a calculator.
Okay, we'll give you a little bit more time here, just in case you are doing your full
I
calculation.
still haven't
Don't
found
wanna,
haven't found the calculator.
don't
app
wanna
yet.
rush you, yeah.
I also have to like actually reference the different charts here, because you got some options here.
Okay, so thank you for participating. And so lots of answers here. For those of you who got D, so 8 times 2, we had a low daily activity. And for that third, the frequency of the workday, it was occasional. So if you ended up taking, the 8 minutes, or sorry, the 5 to 7 minutes, you calculated at 5 times 8 times and 7 times 8 times, you end up getting your number of minutes. We assume it's an 8-hour workday, let's say, and then you end up with that frequency there. And so that first one, when we're talking about answering A with the 5 to 7 minutes, just careful with that frequency. It's considered the number of times the activity was required during the shift. And so not the total time that the activity takes. So that's a little different. And so number of times and times. So just a little bit of caution when we're doing frequency.
I saw a question go through the chat there.
Oh, sorry.
It said how do you calculate it if it's greater than an 8-hour workday?
Great question in the chat. And so we would do it with the percentage of the workday. So you would, if it's 12 hours, you would go 12 times 60 minutes, and then you would end up with a little bit of a different ratio. And so here you can see there are more methods to doing this. There's the frequency of an assumed 8-hour workday, and then the frequency of the job task. So it might just be how often the task is performed. And so just careful with when you're looking at the different templates. All of these methods are different. And so here you can see this has, there's a seldom category in every method of frequency. This one, the number 5, the frequency of job task, has a minor with an M and a major with an M, which is probably not the way you want to have that coded, because one means performing less than 25% of the job, and the other one means a frequent repetition, so more than 50% of the job. And so the caution here is just to look at which one, is being used in your template of choice. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about the frequency scales, so just a little bit, we can start looking at MMH examples. So here's an example. Here's an example strength demands of job table. So the activities are divided in both headings here, with there's a lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling, grasping, and pinching piece. There's a section for comments, the average and maximum force of the load, frequency, with that, NROFC, and it's down on the bottom there. And the moving distance to be recorded, it even gives us in inches, so that's fine. There's one really big thing in this type of table that's missing though, right? And that's the task. What tasks are these strength demands associated with? From this type of table, we can't really understand that. And so when we look at another example, this one's an electronic template. And so the arrows do have drop-down menus to connect to options. So you see up there in the gray. Again, the lifting and carrying physical demands are separated, which is pretty common, even though we know these could be part of the same task. Here it asks for the task number that was previously outlined, in another section of the PDA. Again, the average and maximum force and weight needs to be identified. There's that drop-down menu is nice to be able to prompt us. There's plenty of room in these tables to fill out essential categories and relate each strength demand back to your previously described task. So here's an example strength demands table that has been filled out for a dispatcher in the work yards department. So this is a Pear Deck question here. So you are an ER doctor reviewing this table to determine whether your patient with a broken left arm that you just casted is going to be able to return to work without restrictions. Do you have, so you're going to look at this table, do you have enough information to determine this? What information it might be missing?
So this is a text one, and so as soon as you type your answer into your Pear Deck app, we can see the answer. You don't have to hit submit, it's just there. You can actually do more than one answer. You can keep typing. You can write us a whole essay if you want. We might not have time to read it, but
Absolutely.
We're gonna get some good answers here, I think.
And then I see, can we pull up the chat? There's a couple of people who are just answering in the chat. Sorry.
Well, that's a lot of multitasking.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know if we've done the CDA for this. Do we have the cognitive resources to manage a chat?
I saw some
and a
stuff
Pear Deck?
popping up. I saw some stuff. Okay, so for the most part,
I'm seeing left or right is not specified in this particular table.
that's right. And so a lot of people answering here, fairly obvious. It's kind of a no. And so
It's kind of a no.
it's kind of a no. It's definitely a no. So we don't know what arm plus means. We don't know, this type of template doesn't have the right options to give you which arm is actually the main one being used. The frequency is okay, but again, there's nothing really telling us what those numbers mean, or yeah, frequency could be more specific, absolutely. So, and yes, the doctor really wouldn't have enough information from this type of table. So really well done here with the answers.
So that's a fail all around on that PDA.
So yeah, so this one's not the template we want. Okay. So another scenario. Here's another filled out example. It's a physical demands analysis for a hand cart operator, what they're calling a hand cart operator. So figures of the hand cart here are on the right. The operator walks the streets and sweeps up dirt and garbage with this hand cart. So you are on the Joint Health and Safety Committee reviewing this PDA. You see occasional upper extremity pushing of possibly 36 kilograms or 79.4 pounds. Multiple choice here is how much does the hand cart weigh? Okay, So yeah, really well done. There's not enough information here to determine. I mean, we could maybe guess that this usual kilogram weight of 1 to 5 kilograms might be an indication of what they're pushing or pulling with the hand cart. But really, there's nothing to give us even any information for why it might be a maximum of 36 kilograms. Like, when does it ever get up to be almost 80 pounds worth that they have to push around? And how far are they pushing it? This is not on here. There's a lot of information missing on this one as well. But again, frequency during shift is here. We might get a little bit of idea about that. And so we're going to change gears just a little bit. So that was manual materials handling. So you saw a little bit of what we were seeing in the templates, went through some examples. But now let's look at the posture analysis. And so in the posture analysis, this was one of our research results tables. So vaguely, like without the multiple methods of capturing posture here, I've tried to show you what we're looking at. So the PDA type, that says PRA, that's our peer-reviewed research articles, safe work associations, workers' compensation board, and C is just company. So there were 25 of the 35 PDAs that did complete a posture analysis. So the body parts that were involved in the analysis were primarily the back, the shoulder and neck, with the elbow, wrist, ankle, and hip being assessed occasionally in there. The most analyzed body parts and movements included these ones here on the left that are highlighted for you. The neck flexion, neck rotation, back flexion, back rotation, shoulder adduction and abduction, and then neck extension and shoulder flexion were also evaluated there in the 60% range. So the 17 remaining, body part and movement combinations, they're completed well below a 40% prevalence in the analysis here. The PDA from our workers' compensation board outlined the most body part and movement combinations, but these sections are only to be filled out for the injured body part, and so they included lots. Of that 20 body part and movement combinations that they do in their posture assessment, only 7 of these PDAs actually assessed at least 70% of the outlined criteria. So this really kind of illustrates the discrepancy between what a workers' compensation board requires for assessment of an injured worker and the PDAs that we're actually conducting in the workplace. So another Pear Deck slide here in a posture analysis example. So for the sake of the example, this one is going to be a dots. So you're going to, oh yeah, so we see, yeah.
I made them really small today.
Okay, so you can drag the dots. Apparently you have a maximum of 5 dots. And so for the sake of this example, let's assume that the worker is constantly in this position. Just they're stationary. Let's assume they stay there. Use the dots and place them on the appropriate portion of the posture assessment for this worker here.
So in that task,
yeah,
or like on the actual demand. Yeah.
On the actual demand, if you want to use the frequency, you can use constant if you want, the C.
Oh, I see. We could put them on that last column. Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like a little bit of with the mobility piece in this, again, assuming that they're stationary here. I don't know if we would potentially call this a crawl. In this case,
because the knee is down.
The knee is down. It's definitely not a seated posture. I wouldn't give it sitting. And so this one we would probably, I know we only gave you dots, so we would probably put something crawl, and then you would have to put like some kind of on the knee type of note there. Yes, the posture of the back, bending forward, absolutely. Some here might have a little twist in here, depends on if you're considering the hip movement, but definitely bending forward. And then the reaching, and so here we would consider this to be below chest level, very well done here. And so that's a great job on the posture analysis. So let's do another one. So different posture analysis template. And so here, again, just for the sake of this example, let's assume the worker's constantly in this position. So again, if you could use the dots. Okay. All right, so in this case, so here we're looking at this one, it actually does it by body part. So instead of more of a mobility piece, there's body part. And so it should be noted that this PDA also had it had a neck component and other parts of the body. So in this case, we're looking at probably back flexion, possible again with some twisting. Lateral flexion, difficult to tell, but there could be a little bit. In this case, it looks like just straightforward flexion. So this template has a shoulder specific section that lets you do flexion, abduction, adduction, and extension. And so in this case, we're looking at both flexion and abduction. And so the thing is, this template, I like this template a little bit more because it does give you the images so that just in case you've forgotten what the differences in these words are, it gives you a prompt. So it prompts you right away. You have to relate it back to the task and then the percentage of the shift. And then it also gives you space for a comment. So it is a little bit easier to understand this template. Another posture analysis example. And so here, in this example, we are actually looking at a template for a cook. So the tasks have been identified for you as read and call the order, prepare the meat and entrees, plate and present the food, put up the order, and clean the grill. So in this case, is our Pear Deck up and running?
I think people can answer. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. In this case, let's imagine you're the cook's physiotherapist for a shoulder injury. What range of motion is necessary for the cook to be able to complete their tasks?
I think the answer is pretty obvious.
The answer is pretty obvious, yeah. Okay, so that's right. So here we would just quickly, you would look at the shoulder and maybe a little bit of elbow. You could look at both if you're trying to determine shoulder range of motion. In this case, a forward reach, it does not ever say forward, so we wouldn't really know. It's kind of a trick question. We wouldn't really know if it was flexion, abduction, or abduction, depending on how they're reaching. And so this one's not exactly specific enough to give you that which motion of the shoulder is it. And so, well done picking flexion. I would have assumed flexion as well, just because a forward reach is pretty normal. So. But not specific enough in that template there. So let's look at another example. This one is for meter people. So the average week is 40 hours Monday to Friday. Meter people are assigned to work either one of two shifts. They work 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. They take 2 10-minute breaks and get 1 20-minute lunch. The purpose of the job is to clean and change residential industrial meters. So there are 3 essential tasks. They disassemble and reassemble meters to clean moving parts using pliers, a brush, and a screwdriver and air tool. They disassemble the damaged meters, current and potential transformers to scrape individual parts using a wrench and screwdriver, or they mount current transformers to a coil plate using a wrench, screwdriver, and power tool. So with the Pear Deck here, let's imagine you're a new OHS person. You replaced the person who did this assessment a year ago. One of your workers comes to you with a sprained ankle, and you must determine whether modifications are required. Which tasks, if any, will require modification for the worker?
Okay, so it sounds like the sound cut out.
Oh,
So you better repeat that because they may have no idea what the worker's doing.
sorry.
Okay,
Okay, so
good. So do the scenario again.
okay, so if we give the scenario, so in this scenario, it's for meter people. So they end up, the average week is 40 hours. They work Monday to Friday. They're assigned to work either one of two shifts. It's either 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. They get 2 10-minute breaks and 1 20-minute lunch. The purpose of the job is to clean and change residential industrial meters. They end up with 3 essential tasks here that we're looking at on the left. And then in this posture analysis, they identify the tasks at the top, and then the activities are the back, arm, and legs. So let's imagine you're a new OHS person. You replaced the person who did this assessment a year ago. One of your workers comes to you with a sprained ankle, and you have to determine whether modifications are going to be required. Which tasks, if any, will require modification for the worker? So we got options here: none, task 1, 2, or 3. And just remember up there, it also says the percentage of shift with the essential task. Okay, so if I was looking at this, I would start, exactly like it looks like everyone else is. We're looking at that first one that takes up the major percentage of the task. We're probably going to start looking directly at the legs. Let's not worry about the arms and back to start for a sprained ankle. We got to look at how often this person needs to be on their feet. Looks like they're standing still occasionally in all tasks. There's occasional walking here. And so if you said none, you could be correct. If you said task 1, just based on the percentage, absolutely. If it's 60% of an 8-hour workday, that means that they could be on their feet for at least a minimum of 2 hours. And so you don't know with a sprained ankle what you're looking at, but yeah, task 1, absolutely, or none, depending. Very well done. Now that you can see how important the job overview and task summary section is to setting up a PDA. So in that case, really, there's a lot of debate in the chat. Did not give you any of this job overview or task summary information in these PDA, like in these posture assessments or manual materials handling assessments. And so this is why this task assessment, it's really why sometimes you might actually conduct a task analysis for the job first. So before we go start evaluating specific components of those tasks, you would actually have identified all of the job tasks, the essential versus non-essential ones, before you go to really look at the jobs. So in our research, a job overview or task summary section was identified in 31 of those 37 PDAs that we were talking about. In this section, the information was either prompted, so with checkboxes, or unprompted with like a space to describe. General tasks or description was 68% and job overview was 65%. So they had the greatest prevalence and a lot of variability in how those were taken. And so 13 of those PDAs actually ended up using both sections. And there was an additional, you can see an additional 9 prompts here that were also in this section, and they ranged in occurrence. Sometimes people would capture the non-essential tasks. There was task comments, sections, observations. What's really interesting is the cycle time, the order of the task, and the task duration was really not captured in its own little piece. And so as long as it's being prompted up front so that you know a little bit more about that. And then we only ended up with one PDA that did this strength level, which is really, that's to be expected because these aren't functional job assessments. And so they're assessing the job, not the person. And so this is an example of a job overview and a primary tasks section. So we can notice it's really up to the user to fill this out however they'd really like. Cycle time in terms of what exactly was cycle time, the shift, the task, what are we talking about? It doesn't necessarily give you any of that prompting in this type of template, but it's really common to see one like this.
Now I see that hours per shift is important to answer that other question we were trying to figure out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We need more information always.
Always. Okay.
Yeah. This is another template. They do leave at least a little bit more space for the user to write essential and non-essential job tasks. But again, the template does not prompt the use to provide like the percentage of each time the task is performed. It just says, That's all it's prompting you to, but again, percentage of what time, percentage of that task, or like percentage of that element of the job, or what's happening there. So this template also doesn't prompt us to number the tasks, and so that's really important to capture throughout our assessments, is what task everything is associated with. So if we're going to look at this example, it's a job overview task summary section filled out for a truck driver. And so here I give you a little bit more information, but it's got a really essential work tasks. In the text on the pair deck, you can tell us, what are your initial thoughts about this template? Would you be able to understand what this worker has to do as far as essential work tasks? I have a few thoughts here. So yes, should be able to determine what the worker does, but the frequency label is a little confusing. Yes. And so one thing here that's really good about this template specifically is that they number the tasks to start. So this is great. Then the frequency, I mean, it's up here like that. Again, remember these little frequency bands of you have to pick the lettering. And so pictures and figures, great comment here. Pictures and figures of the tasks, when we add those to our assessments, it really gives everyone an understanding of what's happening. And so I definitely agree that that would enhance this type of essential work tasks section for sure. And so there's a
nice note here about an ordering system for the tasks too.
Okay, yeah. So this is, yeah, so it is really nice. It does put them in order of how they have to do them, it looks like. So this is a really, really well done task setup. So this is that first part that just describes the tasks that we are going to go through in the rest of the assessment. And so I would agree this is a lot of more information, and it's really well done here. So the next part of the next section that we really assessed was the exposure environment section. So this section's it's really interesting. Only 29 of those 37 PDAs actually did any kind of evaluation of any possible exposures to our workers or the environment that they might be working in. So there was prompts here, a little bit. You can see there's a lot of overlap within itself. So for example, there are 5 different ways here to capture the different environmental conditions. There's an indoors, outdoors, temperature, hot, cold, extreme, humidity, humid, dry, weather, atmospheric conditions, and a climate control one. There also seems to be some confusion about the difference between occupational exposures maybe and environmental conditions that the worker's in, and safety hazards. And then sometimes it's ergonomic concerns are brought up in this section as well. And so sometimes what ends up happening with this section, they're really done in 2 ways at this point. There's a list them. And so there's environmental conditions where it'll just tell you, list them here. Maybe they'll put a couple of examples, but again, this was not everything that was on our list that we just had. Then there's another one where it says check them. So all you get is this box, and you just check it, and we have no idea, unless you're really writing something in the comments that goes with it. You're not really specifically saying much about the environmental conditions. And so what might be more effective is for all of you wanting the pictures, here we go. So multiple choice question. So here's a cool example of another environmental and other conditions, it says, from an assessment for road pavers. And so in this example, let's pretend you're the WSIB adjudicator. A file with this PDA comes across your desk. What type of vibration exposure should the worker be claiming they have symptoms of in this case? We've got some great answers here. More than one, absolutely. Or primarily whole body vibration. So if you did like me and just went to that figure and realized, they're probably sitting on that piece of equipment for a while, don't know. it's probably going to be, it can be any of these. So anyone who has to sit on vibrating equipment like this, especially something that would vibrate this much, if you've never seen one in action, they're going to have exposure for whole body vibration. So at the lower back there, their hands from holding on to the steering wheel, and then their feet from actually resting on the machine entirely. And so can any of that really be deduced from this PDA? No, everything that we just suggested is it really just an assumption that we have to make with our previous experience. Nothing here would say, you know, there's nothing to relate back to the task that it happens on, how long it's happening, or whether,
or the interface. Like, I don't know. I don't know that my hands are touching any of that.
Yeah, so this is in list task description, and so it's not saying how long they have to use any of these things for. So we really have no idea. But the assumption here, great assumptions on answering that multiple choice question. Really well done. I would have said the exact same thing. And so if we regroup, so really this section is kind of a mess at this point. If we regroup these into exposures, so let's maybe consider it to be things that are measured outside of our common environmental things. Most likely maybe to have a standard of how you evaluate them, or you need an industrial hygienist to help. Then we could do environment. So let's say things you can easily measure with that, the right type of thermometer, or you can set on a thermostat. Ergonomics, you know, these hazards should be identified in the manual materials handling or the posture analysis or other parts, not necessarily in the exposure and environment section. And then we have safety hazards, which should always be identified ultimately, but this might make it easier to recognize the different types of exposures. But again, have to be able to associate them back to the tasks. So it's super important there. If we don't capture these correctly, it makes it really difficult for us to design and implement any controls for the workers from just, you know, looking at the whole evaluation of their job. And then the last section was just this. It's one of the more alarming findings that we had. Was that only 26 of the 37 PDAs even had a section that outlined the job design elements. So this would be, you know, anything like capturing the work hours, the shift work, if they're working shift work, is it shift rotation? The break schedule, very few, so like less than 20% of the PDAs with the job design section here actually evaluated whether overtime or being on call was required, documenting the work pace, the job task rotation involvement, or any irregular hours. So gaps in any understanding for the job design can really create difficulties for us in managing admin controls and determining any return to work capabilities. So for instance, we can't say if a break schedule will be effective if we don't know what type of breaks the worker's already taking, or if they even get any at all, really. And so this section met the threshold minimally. There was 22 out of the 37 PDAs had a little bit about equipment, tools, and materials. It was mostly to describe the use of the equipment or machinery. Very few PDAs actually captured any additional details about materials, supplies, or hardware. The use frequency sometimes gave examples. Sometimes there was a lot of template variation here. Again, to determine any effective admin controls or whether further testing. So let's say, for instance, you want to do a vibration evaluation. You don't even know if that would be necessary because you're not sure how long people are using that equipment. So this section, again, needs to be really clear and linked back to the tasks.
And we're back. Katie just taught me a new yoga pose. So we're going to jump into cognitive demands analysis now. And so while Katie had pointed out already that there are some deficiencies in the physical demands analysis templates that are out there, they still tend to be the best developed part of a job demands analysis at this point. In those last few slides, she highlighted that the environmental exposures, that section is less well developed than that front end physical stuff. And then if we jump then into the cognitive, it's probably even less developed than that. So there are some gaps, and yet the cognitive demands of each task really should be considered in parallel with all of those other things. It's important to consider it in parallel because what's happening physically and what's happening to your environmental exposure actually impacts the cognitive resources that are demanded of you. And I think what's the easiest example that we can go to is if you're working in a really hot environment, your tolerance for some of the cognitive demands really starts to drop really rapidly. We don't really have a lot of air conditioning, and we're just doing office work. But then you could also add in, now you're not only maybe lifting in a really hot environment, and that's going to impact the cognitive demands on you. So it's that middle part of our 3 rings that we're really trying to get to have the ultimate job demands analysis. And so possibly you have started to see some PDA templates having some reference to, as you can see on the left, psych. Psych what? Okay, maybe it's called psychosocial factors. This is another example on the right. As you can see, most of these examples, it's minimal information that we're getting. Like maybe we're getting it listed as intensity. That's the one on the right. They've got a 4-point scale in there from there's no requirement of all of that up to a high requirement. That's an intensity measure. I don't think we've seen that yet in some of the ones we've looked at. The one on the left is looking at a frequency legend, which again has a variety of ways to quantify that, but really there's only 4 things listed in that one. So you will start to see bits and pieces of these coming into the templates, but we need to have a really more thorough way to consider the demands. This one is starting to get at quite a few of the things that should be considered. So you can see the psychological or the cognitive requirements of the job listed as things like working under pressure, the work pace, things like multitasking, attention to detail often comes up. How much control you have over the pace of work that you're doing. Supervision is something that gets included. Exposure to emotional or confrontational situations, that is a key piece. And then we get into some of the literacy components, and those are things that are listed in this one in particular. So some of them are starting to have the pieces that we need to really understand the full cognitive demands of the job. This one is at least broken out into some categories with additional examples underneath it. And the rating is a simple frequency indication. So this one is nice as well. And I think before I forget to say it, it is important and it's almost critical that cognitive demands are considered on a task by task level. So just doing it as an overview of the job is not going to be as powerful or as effective as a case by case basis. So going back to some of the earlier things that Katie said about really making sure that the essential tasks of the job are enumerated and clearly defined is important. So from the literature, and if you've gone looking, you may have also been frustrated with the amount of literature that is out there. This is one of the chapters, and the references will be available at the end of this presentation, but this is sort of one of the references that thoroughly explores the requirements of a CDA. And so it's broken into the cognitive requirements of the job. So we know that cognitive functioning is an essential requirement that workers must possess to meet the demands of their job, but it's a very complex process. Cognitive demands involve perceiving, organizing, analyzing, communicating, and manipulating the information available to you. Being able to do these actions allows workers to understand, make decisions, create ideas, problem solve, and generally take action while performing their work activities. So you see on the left in the yellow, we have the cognitive requirements that are required to carry out the task. Things like critical thinking, creative thinking, information acquisition, so getting the information, processing it, mental demands, learning, communicating, comprehending, translating knowledge, using your intuition. On the right-hand side, we have the cognitive resources that are required by the individual to execute all of these cognitively based performance skills. And so, we might be listing the tasks of the job as having certain cognitive requirements. We might also be defining the cognitive resources that individual must have in order to do that job. So they have to be able to, the worker has to be capable of using their cognitive resources on the blue side of the table in order to execute those requirements. Now, each job would have unique requirements, and they might be at differing levels of importance. But in any case, the worker has to have sufficient resources on the right side to meet those cognitive demands. And so how do we get to know and define what some of those both cognitive requirements and cognitive resources are? Well, this is an interesting resource. I didn't know this existed until I went digging. So the ONET Resource Center has listings of any type of any type of job that you could imagine. I think I searched ice cream scooper, because I've always wanted to be like summer job. That was my dream. I wanted to scoop ice cream. It never happened. I was cleaning cabins instead. But okay, so food batch makers came up. It wasn't quite what I wanted, but I wanted to know what food batch. So these are the folks who work in mixing scenarios, and there might be mixing the ice cream actually before you get to the scooping part, or like, I don't know, dough, something. So they're mixing. And I've actually just grabbed the graphical summary. If you go into this website, you can actually get a more thorough listing, and they actually have to define 40 different categories and a lot of them do touch on these cognitive resources that are required. Some of them are also relevant for the PDA side of what you're understanding, right? So the handed finger use for sure is a direct category. But I think if you go and explore these options, you will start to see, especially down in the personality here. So we need attention to detail. So there is cooperation and communication scenarios are going to be relevant. The literacy pieces are indicated on that technology side as well as in the basic skills. And so, like I said, this is a fairly not everything that is possible from this website is on this slide, but a great resource to start to understand, what are the requirements of that job, and it is leaning to defining the cognitive requirements of that job. Again, from one of the better, maybe considered the gold standard tool for cognitive demands analysis right now, is the CDA tool from the City of Toronto. And they have actually grouped up these critical cognitive resources and requirements on the right-hand side into the 3 categories I've got on the left. So we've got behavioral demands, things like self-supervision, cooperative work requirements, the degree of responsibility that you must be able to execute in order to do the job. So that's behavioral demands on you. Psychological demands, in that we have got that exposure to emotional situations and exposure to confrontational situations. Probably if you think about your job or jobs that are out there, You will know the types of people who typically get into confrontational situations, law enforcement, lawyers, etc. Emotional situations is a little bit broader and could include quite a few occupations. So those are the psychological demands on you. And then cognitive demands, and I've tried to, group these up or minimize the number that I have on this slide, but things like your memory demands, your attention demands, communication, multitasking, distracting stimuli, types of literacy in which there is literacy, numeracy, technological literacy, and then deadline pressures that might be experienced. And so we're starting to work towards, having a gold standard of everything that should be considered grouped into those categories. So I want you to focus on those three sections: behavioral demands, understanding what those represent, psychological demands, and cognitive demands. So back in the Pear Deck, I have another example of a CDA template that has these psychological cognitive demands listed there. You have one blue dot, one yellow dot, and one pink dot, or purple dot. Can you recall and put those dots against one of the items that is listed that represents that category? So I think folks are identifying for sure that cognitive purple dot is like, they've totally blacked out memory. I'm certain that they've got it on that memory component. They've correctly identified a blue line, the psychological requirements of the task under that exposure to emotional or confrontational situations. That one's easy. There are a couple behavioral ones for sure. It does look like an Easter egg basket for sure. How much control you have over your workspace, your requirement to work alone. We really got a purple line and a blue line and a yellow line and a mess of other stuff. But so determining whether a particular cognitive demand is necessary for a job requires a really in-depth understanding of all tasks. That's why I say that the CDAs really should be done on a task basis rather than broadly looking at the job demands. But once that task has been identified, you need to consider whether each cognitive demand is present for that task and to what extent. We've seen that a lot of the scales use a frequency basis. The City of Toronto tool, again, attempts to be a little bit more definitive by providing a really nice rubric for determining what level, and it's on a 0 to 4 scale with specific descriptions of what is required to score each of those. So, in order to get on the degree of self-supervision required, in order to get a 3, and we can see that the cognitive skills needed are problem solving, judgment, sequencing, mental flexibility, reasoning. You need frequent self-supervision required, but the supervisor is occasionally there to provide some direction. So that's how you would score a 3. So after you've done a number of probes and questions to the workers and the supervisors, you would be in a position to be able to choose which of those very quantitative values to score it as. So here is an example of that section, the degree of self-supervision required, filled out using the City of Toronto CDA tool. The building, so I've got the tasks that require self-supervision. So this is a building manager. They are responsible for managing day-to-day operations of the facility. They interact with contractors, staff, and renters to coordinate the services required. The building manager can contact security services in case of emergency or safety concerns. The building manager maintains the list of repairs and building maintenance requirements, and the building manager reports to a board of directors. After reviewing all those tasks and the amount of self-supervision that's required, this was listed as a level 4. Now, there were some other things that would go along with that. It includes interview questions that you would provide to the individual as well as their supervisor. This time we were looking at the degree of supervision exercise. So not the degree of self-supervision, we're interested in knowing how much supervision of other people happens for this building manager. And so because a complete CDA requires an in-depth understanding of each task, there are a list of questions for each of these categories that you would work through with the individual, with more than one worker if possible, and then you corroborate what you find with the supervisor. The list of questions is a suggested starting point. It's not exhaustive. It should also be considered a work in progress, meaning the next time you do another CDA, you maybe add another question, a prompting question that you would ask in order to determine for each of these categories, what job demand level you're going to score it as. So what I'm looking for, I'm not actually looking for the job demand level. You see that all the times that this building manager must supervise other people. They have to supervise contractors performing cleaning, safety, and maintenance services. They supervise the cleaning staff. They communicate hiring needs to the board of directors. They work alongside security personnel to ensure the safety of the occupants of the building. I want to know what your probing questions are. What other things should you ask this individual in order to understand what degree of supervision is exercised in their job on any given day? So there's a good one. Do you need to exercise disciplinary action? Good one. Is there any time when you have to discipline other employees? That would suggest that there is supervision on your part. That's a great question. Involved in scheduling of multiple staff? Yes, that's correct. How many people are supervised? If so, how frequently? Great question. At any point in time, if your questions can lead to quantification in terms of frequency, that is good. The frequency of supervision, yes. How often do you have contractors? That's right. Frequency of input and duration of input. You might want to specify, is it face-to-face? Is it by email? Is it by phone? That will link to other demands down the road. So in doing a really good job with your questions in one category, you might be able to answer some other sections of your CDA. Oh, good, someone caught that one. How often? Yes. How many employees? Correct. You might want to ask about the consequences of not providing supervision. That would get you to an answer about how important it is that you are the main supervisional leader. Yeah, types of roles that are being supervised. You might ask, has leadership training been provided? Do you have to perform performance appraisal? That would be another question. So thinking about this, these are all good answers. I think you've exhausted my list, but there's probably others in here. Yes, do you have to call in replacement workers? All of these give you an idea of the job demand level. So I think my next slide is going to be a number. Have we reached a consensus based on our reflection on this building manager? What are we going to give this? A 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I've got all my dots showing up. Oh, someone's giving it a 10. No, that's not the right answer. I see my dots lining up on either 3 or 4. And I think, yeah, again, that the critical question here, which we probably haven't answered in our job task description, is whether disciplinary action is required. That's probably where people are not sure whether it's going to go one way or the other. I don't have, I actually have the answer to this. It's a work in progress. That's okay. Another one of the categories of cognitive demands is memory. And a lot of times memory is just like a checkbox, like yes or no. Again, really, in order to fully complete a CDA, we need to think about a lot of different things with memory. Like there are different types of memory. You really need to be able to define, is it immediate memory? And that is going to be both visual and auditory. So that's your ability to learn 4 items in context immediately after hearing them. So the amount, yeah, remembering a small amount over a few seconds. Your delayed memory, which might come in the form of complex, novel, or faces, That's your ability to recall items previously heard and written, or the ability to list items from a note learned earlier. Under prospective memory, we have sort of our work, the ability to perform, or the requirement to perform future actions. So can you remember that the fire alarms have to be tested every 4 months, for instance? And then working memory. So that's that process that stores and manipulates info temporarily. And so the ability to recall numbers and or add and subtract items onto that continuously. So you can see that just one checkbox for memory isn't going to cut it. If we go to the list of questions that you might use in order to figure out what the job demands ranking for memory is, this is what they should look like. So for instance, what must be remembered? How many items have to be remembered? How frequently? For how long? The method of memory used, I just said there were 4, so you need to be able to figure out which type of memory method is being used. Are there any tools to aid memory that are allowed or typically used in that job? What are the consequences of not remembering? Are there time constraints with the memory requirements? And so that's the starting of your probing questions. And you will start to add in more questions as your expertise with doing cognitive demands analysis increases. At all times, after you've done these questions, it's really important to think about what you're going to measure. So the more things that you can measure, the better. And in this case, I'm looking for examples of what could you quantify if you're trying to think about what someone has to remember. And I've got a call center employee up there because they do have to remember quite a few bits of information. But specifically thinking about, you're sitting there watching them do their job, and you're gonna quantify something. That you do this all the time with your PDAs, but you have to start thinking about how you do it with your cognitive demands as well. Good. Number of calls received. Passwords and logins. Ooh. Yeah, usually the first thing that those operators ask you is like, what's your phone number or what's your reference number? So yeah. There's going to be a chunk of information that comes to them. So yeah, you're measuring how many pieces of information they remember each time, how frequently. You time it. Yeah. You have some sort of little tick box. How many times do they do it every hour? So yeah, the length of call, excellent. I'm really looking for objective ways to measure that memory requirement. Has this ever happened to you? They ask for your phone number, and then a second later they ask for it, not a second, maybe like 30 seconds later they ask for it again. Some of them with a good memory resource will be able to pull up at least the area code perhaps, but a lot of times they're having to ask for that information again. So anyone who can't keep that in their memory store is going to need some sort of way to manage those memory demands in the workplace. So a lot of ways to then think forward to accommodations, which we aren't even going to touch on today. No. All right, so yeah, that is really thinking about ways to put an objective value on your cognitive demands. Mm-hmm. So cognitive demands analysis I've given you, I think I've just tried to list the importance of having a rubric, the fact that you need a lot of probing questions to understand the demand that's there. And I've given you some examples of very specific cognitive demands. But overall, our takeaways for sure for the next complete job demands analysis, I think we've highlighted here that there is no standard template for these assessments, but I hope that we've given you things to look for or ways to make your existing template better.
Yeah, absolutely. With the task, I mean, we've really identified that it's a strong job demands analysis is going to use a task approach, and that has to be with both your physical and cognitive pieces, as well as your environmental and exposures. You want to make sure that everything is listed with the task.
And for the objective piece, we know it's critical on the physical side, but I hope that I've emphasized that, you know, it's equally useful when you are trying to quantify the cognitive demands as well. So it happens on both sides.
Yeah, and then as you commented, pictures, they're worth 1,000 words. So we definitely don't be afraid to include them in your analysis methods, but with reference to the task. Always make sure you know which picture goes with which task. And then finally, I mean, the guiding principle here that we've really just talked about is regardless of who reads your evaluation, it's really, really important to make sure there are no gaps. And so everyone should be able to identify something from the evaluation effectively. And if you're having to make people make assumptions, that's when we're gonna have problems with implementing any kind of controls.
Like we maybe don't have a ton of time for questions, and there's probably a ton of questions in that chat.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah,
We may
looks
not
like
have
lots.
answers for
Okay,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions, actually. The first one is actually nice and simple. Can you share the link to the City of Toronto cognitive tool?
I will, I can't do a link in here. Is there a way for us to add some notes when it gets published?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to send me a list of additional resources, I can include that when I send off the notification of the upload to YouTube.
Yeah, that's what we'd like to do.
Okay.
Okay, sure. Okay, the next question is, would factors like a hostile work environment, microaggressions, working with unreliable people, would those also be included within cognitive demands?
Yeah, those are going to be in cognitive demands. They might fall broadly under the exposure to emotional situations. They might also, there are some other categories where they would come up as well.
Okay. With a task approach, the GDA would be very long. How do you balance a comprehensive assessment with a length that is manageable for others to use effectively?
It's a great question. And so, yes, absolutely. These documents are not normally small, but to balance it out, it's really in the design of the document and how you make it, how you make it prompt you, what it's prompting for, how quickly you can essentially, you kind of have to do the ergonomics of your own assessment. And the easier the template is to use, the faster you'll get through it. The more familiar you are, like the number of times you do it, the faster you'll get at it. But really, it's about that task identification piece to start identifying just the essential tasks and starting with those. So tasks that, you know, okay, they do this once a year. This is part of the maintenance or things like that. Remove those to start because you need to, you're right, these do get really long, these documents, but those are kind of the suggestions to keep it effective. But it's also about how many times do you do it? So do you ever go back to it and fix it? Do you ever go back to it and add it? And so that's the continual improvement of your health and safety management system. That's really important too.
Okay. A comment was, so this basically confirms that a lot of these values are subjective and possibly unreliable. Is this requiring more work or standardization?
If they were referring to the cognitive demands, I would argue that the implementation of a standard list of questions, as well as quantifying any of those things that you can measure, moves it out of the subjective category more towards the objective. And I think I highlighted as well that, yeah, you want to interview more than one worker incumbent to that job, and check with the supervisor that what you have described is representative of how they see that job as well. I don't know that physical demands analysis does not tend to lean. I mean, there's quite a bit that gets quantified there. So I don't know if I agree with it being very subjective. Like we are working towards having repeatable, reproducible JDAs being produced.
Okay. Another question goes back to the GDA part. When someone changes the torso position, does it not change their arm position in relation to the torso?
Yes, and so that's where the component of like relative or absolute angles. So your biomechanics. That's a great question. Yeah. So relative or absolute, and how you're measuring that. And so in the posture analysis, that's why it's super important to identify how that was measured. And you would normally pick the angle and describe whether you're doing it from the floor or whether it's in relation to another body segment, for sure.
Can you comment on the use of the tools from a prevention perspective to identify mental or physical injury hazards for assessment and control?
General comments?
I mean, if done properly, they could be a powerful tool.
Yeah, generally these would be able to help you identify, and they're not as, not like a field level hazard assessment where you're immediately identifying safety risks. But at this point, you're identifying prolonged risks to the workers. And so you can, if they're done properly, you can identify which tasks are going to be a risk, and then it's going to help you. There's always a follow-up to these to make sure that you're implementing controls where necessary. At the end, you would summarize which ones are, higher risk than others. And so they could eventually be used that way, if done properly. Yeah.
Okay. Can you comment on the legal and validity of the PDA or CDA in either a legal matter, grievance, etc.?
Yeah, so I don't think we actually touched on this, but it's all, yeah, you're evaluating the job, not the worker. I think that's the tagline that always gets used if you've done that. And if you've done it in this thorough manner that we are outlined, it should stand up.
Yeah, you never cross the line of evaluating it for a specific worker. You're evaluating the job demands and what's required to accomplish that job. And so as far as the legalities, yeah, it depends on where it ends up, but it should be totally fine if you follow a regimented method. But again, there's nothing that's standard, and it's all voluntary in ergonomics.
Okay. Another question was, above shoulder height may be below shoulder height for others. So ideally, depending on the person being observed when filling in the PDA. So should PDAs contain an indication of the height range of the worker that the PDA was measured on?
Yeah, so really good. So in the manual materials handling piece, that's right. So you would identify the heights of the lifts, typically the heights, the distances of the carries, things like that. And then when you're doing your posture analysis, yes, there's a chance that differences in the size of your workers will result in a little bit of a different posture. But again, that's why those are in a range. So the postures aren't absolute. They're in a range of angles.
Okay. When is your paper due to be published?
Very good question. Due to be published. So we will be hopefully finishing it up in the next. We're trying to put together the comprehensive template, really. So it's going to be at least another couple months. If I'm super optimistic, it will be maybe available by the summer. That totally depends on the journals, but yes.
Okay. Is it still an accommodation issue if only non-essential tasks are affected?
Ooh, a really good question. So that would actually just be based on the scenario. So it would depend. You could accommodate that out, really. If it's not essential, that makes it easier. It just depends on how often that has to be done. I can't comment specifically, but that's a great question.
Okay. Could you expand on how time management is considered a chronic health problem?
Well, I guess, so I listed the chronic health problems. So anytime that a chronic health problem may lead to fatigue, I suppose, or instances, yeah, where jobs have to be done in a specific time requirement, if the worker is unable to match that demand, it's going to impact ultimately their ability to do the job, but also their ability to manage their health. So that seems like a
Should shoulder flexion be measured relative to the trunk instead of to the ground or waist?
So I think we've kind of covered this in the posture assessment. It just depends. Should it be? It depends on your preference for how you look at it. But in most of the assessments, it will be measured from the ground. Most of them will assume their deviation from a natural posture, from a stationary standing posture, let's say. So there's a little bit of, you've identified, yeah, there is a little gap there, but it always has to be you always have to make sure that you wrote how you did that.
I think like we're talking about reproducibility. So if you defined how you listed it, then someone else can figure out what that means.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and the final question is basically, should, under the sort of the environmental factors, something like a possible COVID contagion, would infectious disease potential, etc., should be listed or not?
Yeah, so there was a section there that said biohazard, and so it would come up depending on how in-depth your evaluation is of like air quality or air contaminants as well, it may come up. And so in future, yes, it has always been there under, you know, I would say it's always been more biohazard, but it's definitely something to consider for air quality evaluation and air hazard.
Okay, great. Well, Alison, Katie, I want to thank you very much for your time today. It was very interesting, especially, we look forward to seeing the research when it comes out. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone and wish you all a great day. Thank you.